Hey, what's happening, everybody? Welcome back to the show. Today's very special guest is Alex Boyanju. Alex is a psychotherapist and specializes in somatic psychotherapy, in particular EMDR, but he also has a lot of expertise in other fields such as meditation, mindfulness, all that kind of stuff. So we have a really good conversation about what EMDR is because, as you guys know, I've had people mention it to me a lot on this podcast, but I've never actually gone into like the nitty gritty of what exactly it is, what it entails, where it even came from, which Alex is very knowledgeable. So he gives us all of that, the origins of it, and it's actually a very fascinating story. But before we go any further, you can find Alex at his Facebook page, Journey to Wholeness, his YouTube channel, where you can find interviews just like this, or even a more in-depth video on EMDR. Also, his Journey to Wholeness website. Also, Alex will be doing a meditation course in September, so if any of you guys want to check that out, make sure to follow Alex's Facebook page. That's where he puts a lot of his news at. Having Alex on was great, and he really did teach me a lot about the essence of breathing, the importance of EMDR, and the importance of somatic psychotherapy in general, which is something that I've always alluded to. But before I go any further, guys, let's get straight into the video. What's happening, everybody? Welcome back to the Mental Health Chats. I'm Mental Health Casual or Lucky, or whatever you guys prefer. And today I have another very special guest. And, we were kind of talking a little bit off air, and I was mentioning to him that I've heard so much about EMDR, which we'll kind of go into what that stands for and what that means a little bit later in this. I talked about it with Mick B, who was somebody with bipolar and helped her a lot with the trauma of her life so she could kind of just she could just focus on her bipolar and what she needs to do with that. I had Luke Roberts, a firefighter from Australia who had PTSD and from the bushfires, and he used EMDR, and he kind of just said, it was like he didn't have a great word for it, but I think this is a great word for it. It's like magic, right? That's what he kind of explained it as. So yeah, Alex, thank you so much for being on. I'm really excited to talk to you. But before we get into the nitty gritty of all this stuff, could you kind of explain your background with mental health, maybe the first time you experienced it, whether it be through yourself or a loved one or anything or anybody close to you?
When you say that, there's two things that come up in my mind immediately. Is one, I grew up in a family that's post World War II Russian immigrants. So I was born in Russia, and half of my family was killed during the occupation, and the people who survived, my grandparents and uncles and aunts and family, I saw the consequences on their daily lives that combined with growing up in Russia until I was 7. But my parents had influence, so I saw the devastation of that within my own family, and I saw my mother and father carried it, and then I saw how that we call that multi-generational influence of trauma, and that hit me quite early in life, and I felt it palpably in my own family. And then I had my own spiritual crisis when I was around 15 or 16. I had a huge realization at one point that life is impermanent, and no matter what I do, no matter what I gain, it all is like sand pouring through my hands. When I had that realization, it really sparked a curiosity to dig much deeper into who am I and what is existence, what is mind, what is spirit. It really led to a lot of curiosity around that. And fortunately, I was drawn to the Eastern philosophies and practices, and then combined it with my Western approach to psychotherapy. And my life has since then, I'm 53, it's going to be 40 years, something like that my life has been dedicated to the integration of Eastern and Western psychotherapy and philosophy.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I think, you bring up a lot of interesting points there from, the generational trauma And also this, when you talked about this idea that life is impermanent and all that kind of stuff, it reminds me of, funny enough, a guy named Steve-O from the show Jackass. He has a podcast, and he just said flatly one time, he's like, how messed up is life that we go through trying to survive, knowing that we'll never just survive to, like, we're never going to just not survive. One day we will die. And it's a very interesting dilemma that we have to kind of deal with through whatever way that you have to go through that. But I want to go back to what you said about marrying the two, the Western and the Eastern. Could you kind of explain what some of the differences are between those? Because I feel like they both have very beneficial things about them. But when you say like trying to bring them together, I mean, what parts of each one are you trying to bring together, and for what purpose?
Oh, it's a huge question. It's a big question. I've been formulating that and looking at that, for so long. And at this point with people that I'm working with, it's seamless. I don't think about East, West, or, it just is the way I'm seeing things and understanding things. Look, Western psychotherapy came out of a Cartesian model of the split between mind and body. And it goes much further back in history, that in Western thought we often associate ourselves as thinkers, right? Descartes, I think, therefore I am, right? So what happens in the West, we experience disembodiment, and it's almost like this vehicle for, I'm just giving, by the way, broad classifications. Not everybody feels this way, but this is just giving, let's say, a picture here, is that I am thinking and I'm with the mind, and my sense of self is somewhere up here. And that happiness, let's talk about what's next then. Therefore, if thinking is the way that I'm going to operate in my life, what is going to be the value of my life? What's important? And what we see here, since we're disembodied, what do we start to pursue from a thinking mind perspective? And in the thinking mind, it's going to be, I'm going to pursue fame. I'm going to pursue being something of importance. I'm going to pursue the way it's all these pursuits that are more on the outward based philosophy. That goes along with being a thinking mind, you see. But, we're fortunate that from the time of, let's say, Freud to now, we're looking at 100 years. The transformation has been incredible. And the work of Carl Jung really changed the understanding of the human psyche and the soul. And really, for me, I'm a Jungian at heart to bring those teachings into, and he was the closest to the East that we have in the West. And his understanding. And if you look at his magnus opus, which is the description of the stages of working with the psyche, they're so beautiful, so elegant. And they work, and I use those stages. I work with people through those stages, right? And in the East, the core is what's called being. We are embodied beings. And our conditional identity, everything that we learn that gets packaged onto us, is not really who we are. And therefore, our main function is not the thinking mind or the emotional mind. It's the quality of being. And what is that experienced as? What are the qualities? A feeling of wholeness, a feeling of spaciousness, a feeling of aliveness, love, power, sensuality, our true voice, clarity, clairvoyance, wisdom. And so those are cherished, but they're cherished not because we create them. They are natural endowments to each one of us. You see, in the West, we start off with, there's something wrong with me. In the East, we start off with, you're perfectly divine and there is nothing wrong with you. Look at the contrast, right? So then you can see how my work has been in working with Westerners primarily some people from the East, in having them recognize without, by the way, there's no religious need, there's no philosophical. I don't dabble in with people in philosophies and religions. I work with what I call direct experience. That's the key. So I'll give you an example of direct experience. You're drinking your, let's say, your coffee, and most of the time we're not conscious. So we're drinking the coffee, the taste is mildly there, but we're thinking about going to work. So what's happening in that moment, the limitation of attention causes us then to go into a thinking mind instead of direct experience. Well, what happens in direct experience? In direct experience, the richness of the coffee seems to just explode. So in the power of the now, which is very East, right, is all about experiencing life in the moment with fullness and without all of the overlayings of the baggage. And you see, in the West, everybody's been trying to figure out, how do we change a person's thinking? It's not what we're doing. We're not changing thinking. You can't change thinking unless you change the way the person perceives themselves. That's the key. If I perceive myself as there's something wrong with me, or I'm lacking something, I'm sorry, what kind of thinking am I going to have? Therefore, thinking and emotions and sensations follow from the way that we perceive ourselves. Okay, that's just to give you a short overview. I mean, there's a lot of details in there.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think that like plays into the heart of, a lot of what I've had to do over the years of, or well, over the year of doing this channel, right? Is, I think a lot of things because of my anxiety, but I also have the empirical knowledge that I can do these interviews and that I'm seeing results from them. And so it also, I think that's the other problem. I was a philosophy major, and I think that's one of the problem with some philosophers is that they stay in that thinking mindset, but they never I'm trying to remember who it was. I think it was Hannah Arendt, but somebody had actually, she never really liked to be called a philosopher because a lot of times they just kind of stay just thinking and writing these crazy ideas,
Correct.
but they don't really try and get
Out.
yes, yeah, exactly. And I think I think you described it really perfectly, is that we kind of stay into this intellectual mindset, which is, it has its places, don't get me wrong, but obviously if you just omit everything because of that intellectuality that you're holding on to, it can become very detrimental to other things in your life, your physical health, your spiritual health. And before we go any further, I do kind of want to get into EMDR, just because I think it's just such a fascinating subject. And as I had as I had kind of alluded to before, I had a couple of guests that had vouched for it pretty well. But could you first off describe what does EMDR stand for, and what is the process of that, and who benefits from it? What kind of patients would benefit from it?
Sure. Let's give an overview as we look at EMDR. EMDR, which stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, that's the technical term for it, it doesn't stand alone. It's a part of a whole system of understanding, right? And most people who are EMDR therapists also come with a particular way of looking at the human being, and they use the EMDR in light of that particular viewpoint, right? So here's how it began for me. I was working for an organization that was specializing in addiction. And I started in 2007. And I started noticing that all my training and all my life working with people, and now I specialize in addiction, I was like, I'm needing to get clear here on what's going on, because addiction is complex. And then in 2015, I was like, you know what? I'm hearing a lot about EMDR. Let me go get trained. So I got trained in Connecticut with an amazing teacher. She runs a great center. I finished my initial training and I said, I need more. And I immediately went into a year-long, what they call the advanced training. Not everybody does that. And I spent a year long with a mentor guiding me through all my clients. And that was the most transformative. So now it's 2021. For the last 6 years, I've basically incorporated EMDR with everyone, with everything, meaning that no matter who I see now, everybody experiences EMDR because it is that effective. Okay. So the history of it is interesting. Francine Shapiro, who was the founder, now it's what, 25, 26 years ago. There's a story that the way she kind of discovered it, and I'll give you the quick version of that to see, so you can see how it's connected to the modern day, practices. The story goes that she was walking, if I'm correct, in the woods, and she was slightly anxious, and she noticed that at some point the anxiety had gone away, and she tried to retrace what was going on. What she noticed eventually upon reflection is what she was looking left and right along the path, bilaterally moving her eyes. She had no idea why, and she dove into the research, and of course the science behind it, it takes a long time to kind of read about this, but the science behind it basically was not there. There was very little information about anything about eye movements, right? But if you notice, we do things rhythmically as human beings, and often bilaterally, we don't even realize it. When you're walking and you're moving bilaterally, if you really get into the groove of that, something happens to you. You actually experience a shift. When you're drumming, bilateral, okay? So we as human beings, we do a lot of things bilaterally that we don't realize, and it has a great impact on us. So the research eventually brought us to a period where they realized that bilateral movements, bilateral eye movements, bilateral hearing, bilateral tappers, they use tappers where you can feel a pulse on each hand, bilateral tapping on the thighs. All these bilaterals have a great impact on trauma. So now let me connect trauma to EMDR. When we're born, when we're conceived, one of the first things that gets laid down is our nervous system. There is no thinking or emotions yet. It's literally the nervous system. What's the nervous system? The nervous system is the interface between the body and the outside environment. It's incredible, by the way. So the nervous system is not an identity. The nervous system is this amazing, complex, responsive, intelligent, by the way, functioning that helps us survive, hopefully thrive, okay? So what happens? As the nervous system is laid down, it picks up all the information from the environment. It's looking for, oh, here I can thrive. Here is dangerous. So the nervous system is constantly modulating our life and interpreting information to create a picture that says, do this in order to thrive, do this in order to survive. So it's a constant, thrive and survive is a constant kind of dialogue that's happening in the nervous system. Well, in utero, the mother's energy, what she's doing, what she's eating, what she's experiencing from the outside in her environment starts to interface with the nervous system. This is our first place where we get conditioned. This is the conditioning, or another way of saying a molding, right? Then we're out in the world and we're in the environment of the family, the culture, the society, the religion, the ethnicity, all those big boulders of influence. And no one in the human condition can escape being molded or conditioned. The difference is the following. I'll give you a scale. On the one scale, we have parents who've done their good work on themselves, have transformed their own historical things, and now bring to their child the kind of energy that allows the child to be their fullest self. Let's put it that way. Then we have on this side, we have the worst atrocities of a parent. You know what I mean? The violence, the abuse, and all these kind of things, right? So this whole spectrum creates what we call trauma. The word trauma in Greek is trauma. And what it means, the translation of it means to rupture. Look how amazing the word is. Rupture. What are we rupturing? Here's the child's trajectory of being, and here comes all these influences. And if the influences are large enough T's, large enough traumas, they rupture the child from the cocoon of being themselves. The child has to then leave that to accommodate to the environment and separate from themselves. How do they do that? They find it. We as children are creative, so we adapt these personas and these masks, these archetypes, to help us survive within our own families. But the consequence there is we have to leave ourselves. You see? So trauma then creates, not simply, but trauma creates contraction in the body, in the mind, and emotions. A kind of what I call an inflexibility, a rigidness. Why? The more trauma, the more there is need for survival. There's no room for thriving. Life is about surviving, which is another way of saying life is about keeping safe. Right? It's a lot of energy. There's a lot of energy that's just used to create safety. Well, then we look at the person's life and we see, what is their work life like? Oh, what is their relationships like? What is it like about their self-care? Like what happens? They play out their early environments in this way. So when a trauma happens, there are certain memories, emotions, and thoughts, and a negative self-perception that's locked into place. I'll give you an example. Child is, let's say, in the kitchen. Mom and dad are cooking something. The child, is grabbing a cup of water, and the cup breaks, and the father says, "You stupid kid." In that moment, that child has to attend to the violence of that moment. They then have to create a sense of saying, there must be something wrong with me. Most children don't blame the parent because they can't get mad at the parent because that's their safety system, right? So we can't rage at the dad because that is, who knows what's going to happen if I rage with dad. So what do? I suppress my emotions. I suppress my thinking. It must be me. I'm bad and let me be good. Okay, daddy, what do you want me to be good? Okay, you're going to have to clean this up and do whatever you have to do. And then the child now learns to be good. I have to do these things. So what do? They grow up believing that kind of stuff later on as well. That one moment, that child will at some point maybe forget that moment. Watch what happens. On a conscious level, they're going to forget it. But it's in the wiring now. It's stored in the brain and in the nervous system as information. You have information on your computer that doesn't always operate unless you call upon it. It's sitting there, but it could be influencing the functioning of your computer. If you have a code somewhere that's slightly not written correctly, it's still functioning, but it's got some glitches, right? Same thing we carry. So what does EMDR do? We ask the person to bring up those memories, if they have them, that really were instrumental in forming who they are. Now, a person might not see that, but I'll see that in my conversations with them. And after a couple of sessions, I'll see that the person is just repeating the same themes over and over again. Once I see the themes, they're all the same. They're always the same, right? Once I catch the theme and I catch the theme in the present, I'll start asking questions of how that's connected to something, and they'll be like, "Oh my goodness, I didn't realize that those moments are this moment is the extension of those moments." So that those incidents are still living as the echo into the now.
Yeah, that's very powerful. And I think, it's funny enough, my last guest, Dee Woolridge, actually, it was funny enough, I kept saying, my social anxiety. And she finally kind of heard that. And she was like, I mean, why do you say my social anxiety? And we kind of went down, a little bit of my past with my father and feeling
feelings of insecurity. Never, he never really praised me for anything. In fact, he was always asking me, how come you're not doing this? How come you're not doing that? And I think it was a really big changing point for me. And I really thank you for this, even though, in the moment I was uncomfortable because we were on air and, I was supposed to be the interviewer. But then I realized, if I'm going to be a mental health advocate, I have to at least be able to talk about my own, right? And I think that's a very key thing. But I really like what you're saying about even if you don't remember it, it's still stored up in your body. And I'd actually asked somebody that has oh my god, I'm gonna forget this, trichotillomania, where you pull out your hair. And she was telling me, she can't really remember a lot of the things that had kind of happened. And I asked her, what do you think is worse, not remembering or remembering too much? And she said, not remembering at all, because I don't know exactly where to kind of go from there. Now she does do somatic psychotherapy and all that kind of stuff now, but at the time it was kind of like that. Whereas I'm very, vivid. I can kind of remember almost everything that's happened to me. But then I started kind of looking at myself. I was like, wow, that's actually kind of cool that I can not remember it in the certain way, but now that I know where to kind of go to, because every time somebody asks me, oh, where do you think that comes from, I can usually trace back exactly where it is. But at the same time, I think that's where I really find a lot of this somatic psychotherapy very very interesting, because when we think about, and we kind of talked off air a little bit about the presentness that comes with it. One of the things that is gaining headway, but I don't think enough headway, if that makes sense, is like mindfulness training, mindfulness meditation. Could you kind of explain, maybe through your own viewpoint, or if you know any studies or anything like that, but what is the main goal of mindfulness training to be? Obviously, it's to be mindful, but whenever I go into some of these, sometimes people aren't ready for it or something like that, but how do you get the most out of mindfulness training when you're or mindfulness meditation, so to speak? How do you kind of get the most out of that mindfulness?
Let me back up before I go into mindfulness on the EMDR. You said that you have memories, right? When you have the memories, do you have physical sensations, emotions, and thoughts associated with it?
Mostly it's kind of like what I was doing right now, where I kind of look up. If I can remember right, sometimes I get my my stomach kind of tenses up. Kind of
Right.
in it's almost like a response to being hit. It was what I always used to do whenever my dad or my relatives would hit me. I would tense up just so I'd kind of get a. It was just so my body would get ready for the hit before it actually happened. So in
That's right.
response to it. So yeah, those are usually some of the main responses that happen whenever I'm thinking about that.
So what we would do with EMDR is to start to calm down through EMDR the physical and emotional response.
Instead of going to the mind response
So
first, so going
that's
to
right.
the, yeah, exactly. Okay.
Go to the body response. You remember what I said? You can't change thoughts without changing the body.
Mm-hmm.
And since the nervous system is wound up, you can't change the nervous system through thinking per se. You have to change the nervous system to change thinking. So the EMDR plus mindfulness meditation. Look at this, and I teach meditation all over the world. So this is what I do, right? So combine those two together. Those are the powerhouses for dealing with that kind of trauma-based history, right? So we would calm the nervous system down, and as the nervous system would calm down, the way you look, the way you remember the images would start to change. The image would come up, but it wouldn't have the same emotional and physical intensity. And you would have a moment of being like, oh, wait a second. I'm okay. I'm safe. It wasn't my fault. You see, the moment that the nervous system calms down, it gives us an opportunity to actually look at what happened from not the perspective of the I am a bad child. It gives us an opportunity to look at it from the perspective of the more adult mind that's sitting here right now without the trauma. So the EMDR removes the childhood perspective, look at this, and leaves the adult perspective to look back and say, of course it wasn't my fault. Do you see what happens? This is what happens with EMDR with every single person. And the moment the person says, that wasn't my fault, look at the amount of relief that comes with that after living, let's say, 20, 30, 40 years with, that must have been my fault. Okay, that's the impact of the EMDR.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that's a really crucial point. I didn't actually think that, when I asked you that about mindfulness, that you were actually going to piece them both together. But I think that's kind of what we're definitely talking about, right? Is marrying the East to the West, marrying.
I married them. I married them. They're married. and let me explain to you why they're married, and they're a very good marriage. They're an excellent marriage, better than most. So. Mindfulness is a misnomer in the West for everything to do with meditation. It's incorrect. The term mindfulness is poorly understood. And so let me back up on history just for a minute to bring us up into why mindfulness has become the craze. When yoga and Buddhism came into the West in the 1950s and 60s, it was during a time of revolution, right, for us. Vietnam War, people going through, trying to change women's rights, all these things were coming in, and here comes yoga, and here comes Buddhism, two great powerhouses of embodied being practices, and the West goes crazy and it explodes, okay? And when I came on the scene, in the 1980s, early 1990s, I was a Buddhist since I was 17, and trained with in New York City with the great Vietnamese monk, his group, Thich Nhat Hanh. I practiced with his group for about 10 years of doing insight meditation with them, and then another 20 years with a Tibetan Buddhist tradition, and in the last 5-6 years have done the embodied meditation practices. So all of that combined together is about meditation practice. But in order to understand meditation practice, we have to understand, what does it mean? Why do we do this? What's going on inside to do this thing? Meditation is misunderstood as just a technique. It's not. It's a whole world view and understanding of who I am. So the word in Tibetan for meditation is gom. It means to become familiar, to repeat something, to become familiar with it. So gom, and if you think about it, to become familiar with what? Who I really am, my true self. Meditation practice, the goal is to relax into our true nature. Okay? So what is our true nature? It is that experience that is experienced as spacious, timeless wisdom and knowing and presence and aliveness. It's those qualities. And that's just not an experience that happens once. Why? Meditation practice helps us to do a few things. It has a few, sort of say, aspects to it. Number one, what does it do? First thing that meditation practice does is calms the nervous system down. Why? What's one of the most common meditation practices that's taught in the West? Follow your breath. Follow your breathing. Wait a second. You mean just following my breathing is a meditation technique? Well, let's understand the psychology, the physiology and philosophy of this. Let's go back to trauma. What happens when we experience trauma to our breathing? And then I'm going to come back to meditation. This goes right to what happens?
Well, whenever it's fascinating hearing you talk about it. Just to go on a little bit of a segue, just real quick, was, I used to be in MMA and mixed martial arts, and it's fascinating hearing you kind of talk about meditation and the the idea behind it of going back to our true selves, because it's interesting. I'm very whenever I was doing mixed martial arts, I was kind of thinking so much in the moments. And I was always like, oh, what is he going to do? What is he going to do? What is he going to do? And then one of my coaches eventually got to me and he said, why do we do drills? And I said, I had no idea. And he's like, so it's muscle memory. So you don't have to think when it happens. Right. And I think that's it's an interesting thing. I kind of thought, oh yeah, not thinking would be bad, but that drilling was kind of our meditation when we would go through drills, pulling guard, doing the 1-2 in certain situations. And eventually it got to the point where, in practice, all of a sudden somebody would throw something and my body would just react without me even having to have that extra energy output of like, okay, let me throw the 2 and then I'll do this. And, my body just kind of did it because it knew what to do. And it almost sounds like that's where the meditation comes in for us to really, really come into. And, actually, before I went on that segue, I did kind of forget what your question was about trauma, right?
I said, what happens to breathing in a moment of trauma?
Yeah, well, I mean, I can speak for myself. I'm sure it's pretty common, but it starts to get shallower. You start to take less breaths and all that kind of stuff.
That's it.
Yeah,
we call it contraction, right? So what happens is, imagine a child, let's say 5 years old. That whole scenario with the father and the cup happens. When the father is like, "You're stupid," the child goes, "Ugh!" And in that moment, if there's enough of those moments, what happens is the contraction in the body teaches the body that we're in fight or flight. So therefore, breathing is always going to be shallow. By the time we're in our 20s, we only breathe 50% capacity in our lungs. Let me repeat that again. 50 to 75% capacity in our lungs, which means, look what's happening. We're not oxygenating into all of our cells completely. And when we're not oxygenating, we are still keeping the system in fight or flight, which produces adrenaline and cortisol. Adrenaline and cortisol in the brain tells the brain to lay down wiring for more survival. Okay, here comes meditation practice, right? This is a long way around, but you have to understand why we're doing what we're doing. Otherwise, what's the point of talking about some technique? It has to be within a much larger understanding of the human being. So in the beginning, when we start to just breathe, like right now, taking a full deep breath in through the nose, on the exhale, releasing tension in the body, breathing in without any strain. It's a relaxed breath, right? Without any tension. When you breathe in with no tension. And then on the exhale, it's like an emptying. Just feel that you're just literally letting go of everything. Let it go. Starting out from the musculature. All the muscles start to become pliable again. We're telling the nervous system, it's okay. It's safe now. See, now that's the first step. Now we've calmed the system down a little bit. And then we say, now, in addition to your breathing, pay attention and bring your attention to the breath. Meaning, as you're inhaling, be aware that you're inhaling. When you're exhaling, be aware that you're exhaling. And some people like to feel, they use the sensations of the breath coming in and out. Some people use counting as a way to stay focused on the breath. And some people don't do anything and just literally just keep their attention melted together with the breath. What does that do? Another layer of deep letting go. Very deep letting go. But in the letting go, we also become disengaged from our thinking, from our emotions, and from our sensations. In a positive way, disengaged, meaning disentangled. It's almost like, imagine you were watching a movie, you went to the movie theater and you went to the IMAX movie theater, and they're playing this movie called Your Life, and you're sitting in the front seat and you're in the movie watching it like this, right? It feels very overwhelming at that moment, and you really believe that every scene in the movie is really who you are. Meditation practice allows us to step back and go to the back of the theater, all the way to the back of the IMAX theater, and watch the movie from a different perspective and look going, I see what's going on. Wow, that's interesting. And here comes EMDR. The EMDR supports that even further by helping us shift in the way that we're looking at it. So meditation practice and the EMDR starts to complement each other. Okay. Then we go deeper. Then the meditation practice eventually reveals something to us. We start to have glimpses of insight. We realize, I am not my thoughts. I am not my emotions. I am not my sensations. I am not those things. Well, what's the obvious next question? Is like, well, who am I? Who am I? The next stage of meditation practice turns the attention on this subject called I. And what we realize, here's the biggest aha that most people have, is that the moment they turn their attention on themselves, they realize that who they think they are is who they think they are. You understand? And that moment is such an aha moment to be like, wait a second. I'm thinking of who I am. Wow. Okay, let's give some room to that a little bit. Let's step back from that. And all of a sudden, there's a moment there of complete and utter silence and clarity that happens. And that deep realization that I am free. I've always been free. And I'm full and complete. And then we deepen that with EMDR and meditation practice. There's a lot more. Yeah.
Yeah,
Stages.
absolutely. No, I'm sure. I mean, I doubt we could, even cover the, I'm sure we can kind of get a, like a topics briefing of of a lot of these things. But I think that does bring up a lot of interesting points, right? I mean, I brought this up in my last podcast, but one time I had to going back to martial arts, I had to spar my instructor at one point because it was sparring time, and another instructor came up to me in between rounds because I got my butt kicked the first round, and he kind of came up to me and said, what are you doing? You're getting kicked around. What are you doing? I'm like, he's my instructor. He's better than me, right? I had this perception of who he was, and I just felt like I didn't belong in there. And he said, no, none of that. You're going to go punch him. You're going to go take him down, and you're going to implement your strategy. And once I heard somebody kind of say that to me, I was like, oh, okay, I guess I'll just punch him. I guess I'll just take him down. The things that I'd practiced, in drilling. And without really thinking about it, he was on his back, and I was like, oh, I can't believe that worked. And so it's an interesting point that we're kind of bringing up here, is this idea of, and even when we were going through that exercise of deep breathing, and you said, not to tense up, not to, it was interesting when I realized because back in, I used to play trombone. One of the main things that we learned about was breathing, right? Because if you have these shallow breaths, you're going to get a shallow tone out of your instrument. And so, when we were doing breathing exercises, everybody would go out like, and, they'd have their instruments, go up like 2 feet in the air, and they'd be like, no, stop it, relax, because if you're, people think that you have to tense up to do high notes, but it's actually the opposite. You need to relax so that more air can go through. And I think that's it's crazy how universal breathing is, right? You think it's kind of an afterthought to most people, but it really is. If you shoot a gun, you go on the out breath. If you, just anything like that. If you're punching, you let out some air so you don't get the air knocked out of you. It's such a foundational thing for everybody, and I think that's that's such a powerful thing. And one thing I did want to go into was this idea of shame and what your opinion is on it, because I'm wondering, does shame have any place? Does it have any good sides to it? I bringing myself into this, for example, like shame, I believe got me out of alcoholism, because I was, at one point I was drinking and driving, and I was feeling all this, shame about, I lost some friends over it. And I think that ultimately led to a good result. But, what are your thoughts on shame? And do you think there are ways that it can benefit us in some ways? And how do people get over shame if there's too much of it, if they're having an unhealthy amount of it?
Big topic.
Mhm.
Remember what I said to you about the formation of the human psyche? Remember, in a moment of trauma, the negative self-perception is what holds the child hostage. Well, when we perceive that there's something wrong with us, what's the next emotion that we're going to feel? Shame. Okay. So shame is not inherent to us in that moment. Shame is something we experience about ourselves, but it was told to us by somebody else. So we feel a shame in that moment. For what? For being who we are. Look at this. So if I take the word shame and translate that into another word or energy, it means the feeling of disappointment and inability to really be myself. And then shame is like an energy that binds us into the negative self-perception. So it's like more glue to it. And then guilt also comes into it. And what's guilt and shame all about? It's keeping the negative self-perception going, right? So that's the function of them inside the child's experience. We'll talk about adults and maybe if there's a positive function on it, we'll talk a little bit later. But this is the shame that's built in within the psyche, within each individual. You understand? So a lot of times people use either shame or guilt as the way that they describe, like, oh, I felt guilty or I feel shame. And what you see with them, more trauma, more negative self-perception, a lack of really feeling, if you ask somebody like, hey, and you meet somebody who's been doing the good work on themselves and they're like, I'm good with me, they're not going to have shame or guilt. And even if you ask them, do you, when you look back on your life, are there moments that you maybe regret and stuff? Like, I thought this to myself. If somebody asked me, hey, Alex, are there moments in your life that you're unhappy about? I'm going to say this. I will look at every one of those moments and it will not be with shame and guilt at all. It will be a deep understanding of myself at that moment in that history of time. I'm compassionate to my own levels of awareness and development at each phase in my life. And yes, are there moments that if I have, this insight now to say I would have done it differently? Of course. I mean, we could all say that about our life. But the one thing I don't ever have is shame or guilt about it. But I do have a deep yearning then to try not to repeat that again. So that's the key to the shame there. Is there a value in shame? So let's talk about your situation for a minute, because you bring an interesting point. So it goes like this. You said that you felt that it was the shame that got you to quit, right? That's what you said.
Yeah, I think if anything, I guess maybe a better word would be a catalyst, I suppose, for it.
Okay, so how? Can you describe the mechanics of the shame as the catalyst?
I guess the best way to describe it would be I was in a situation where the next morning when I woke up, I had lost 2 or 3 pretty close friends to me. And I started realizing that drinking wasn't just affecting me anymore. I was okay if it killed me at that time. But once it started affecting other people, because I thought I had gotten rid of that effect when I stopped drinking and driving. I thought, oh, now other people aren't involved and I can do what I want to myself and nobody will be hurt. So I think in that sense, that's where the shame kind of came in, was the fact that all of a sudden I realized my actions were affecting more than just myself, and that kind of like what you had said a little bit earlier, was that I needed to kind of change.
All right, so let me break that down and remove the word shame,
Mm-hmm.
because really what's happened is this. Let's look at the mechanics. I like to discuss mechanics. You didn't like that you lost your friends, correct?
Mm-hmm.
The not liking of that made you reflect to see, wait a second, am I doing something that's causing them to not want to be with me? And the answer was yes. So you made a decision on what was more important to you, the experiencing of the drugs or the experiencing of the friendships, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that really what was going on?
That's interesting. So it almost sounds like when we view things as shameful, it just creates a cage where it just kind of
It's a
stays.
cage. It's a
Yeah.
cage.
And
It's a
so
cage.
whereas if we're looking at it in with context, I think that's the main key that you're talking about right now
That's right.
is context, right? I was at a terrible point in my life and all that kind of stuff. And so when
And you
if I
weren't happy. You weren't happy with what you became.
mm-hmm.
But the fact is, look at the crux of that. Who is the one who became unhappy with yourself? Were there two yous or there's one you? See, so what happened was this: that your true self, your true nature,
Mm-hmm.
was no longer no longer sort of say able to just to be squashed, right? And part of our true nature is enjoying the closeness of these relationships. So part of what you really wanted, which was aligned with who you are, was these friends. And since the alignment of who you are was broken, that created shame. In this case, I'm not liking the way I'm going and becoming this way. Do you see how I'm breaking it down? It's very important to understand that.
Yeah, it definitely sounds because I feel like sometimes shame can be used to stop the argument or stop the conversation at that point. And so, kind of like when you call somebody evil, right? Like it just kind of stops all reflection on what has happened and what led to a
That's right.
person to that place. And I think,
That's right.
that's actually very like enlightening. I'm learning quite a bit in this interview, and I think that's why I love to do these so much is when you get people from different backgrounds, they can kind of shed a light differently on what you think about, and I thought about that
Right.
question a lot about the whole time travel, like if you had a time traveling machine, would you go back and change this or that? And I've always said no, just because I
It wouldn't be who I am.
exactly. But I never actually thought about the idea of, even without that time traveling machine, it seems like there are still parts of my life where I'm still looking back with shame, right? And so
Yeah.
it's yeah, so I think that's definitely a good point. I'm writing notes in the
Let,
background, kind
let,
of
let,
just
let,
yeah.
let me ask you a question.
Mhm.
Um, why not look at them with love? What would be the difference? Why shame as the lens for reviewing? Who said that that's the only option that you have to review your past?
Hmm.
Baskin
Yeah.
Robbins has what? Baskin Robbins has 32 flavors. Well, who said the only way to review my past is through shame?
Hmm.
Why not tenderness? Why not love? Why not rage? Why not hate? I mean, I can come up with why.
Hmm.
Because because that's the lens you're familiar with.
Yeah, and I think it also brings up what we were talking about before, right? What gets results? Well, shame really doesn't bring any results with it, so why would you keep going with it? It's a very interesting thing going back to what we were talking about with, trauma as it kind of if it goes unresolved, it can kind of change things a lot in your life, and I think that's a
Yeah,
little
of
bit of
course,
what kind of happens, or in my case, I'll just speak for myself. It happened to
of
me,
course.
right? I started looking through life through a certain lens, and that was the lens that was given to me, but it wasn't the lens that I chose, right? And so I think that's a very
That's it.
I think that's a very I'm learning a lot from this in terms of I really like talking about the inner makings of a lot of these things. I feel like sometimes when I do talk about these things, I kind of talk about them surface level, and so I think
Yeah.
that is an interesting. I really like how deep you're delving into a lot of these things, and I do want to kind of ask you. You had mentioned a little bit before I asked my final, your message to the people. When we talk about spirituality or spiritual health, mental health, physical health, it seems like how do you describe, a holistic approach? Because I feel like sometimes when people come from a certain side, right, their physical health is great, they feel like the others to get in the way sometimes, or for example, with religion or with spirituality and mental health, sometimes I come from a very religious community in the Samoan community. And they're kind of very much, at least the older people are very much, we need to pray to God and it'll get better. And mental health kind of gets in the way of that philosophy, right? And so how do you view a holistic approach? Is it incorporating all of these things together and figuring out how to, as we said kind of before, marrying the ideas? I mean, how do you kind of approach that topic?
It's very simple actually, because it has to do with the results. Meaning that if I want to get to an island and I'm going to go on a straight path, another person gets on a different kind of boat and goes this way. Another person gets on a raft, they go this way. Another person gets on a surfing board, goes that way. The bottom line in everything is, does it produce the results of freedom in being who I am? So for me, I don't care if a person wants to say, I'm going to spin around 3 times, fart once, and then pick my nose, and that allows them to experience their own complete fullness. Why do I care? So to answer your question, it's very simple for me. It's in the pudding. If the person experiences the letting go of their conditionality, so here's my true self, and here's all that jumbled up stuff that covers it. It needs to get removed. This needs to get revealed. This needs to get removed. This needs to get revealed. How to remove this? I don't care. I don't care. If it works for you, it works for you. If that means praying to God, beautiful. If that means saying mantras, great. If that means sitting on the beach and just breathing deeply, great. Why does it matter? It doesn't matter. It's got to work. And a therapist, a good therapist, must understand how to help their client within the context of their worldviews and belief systems and so forth, to help them do the same thing. Not to adopt. I don't preach. That's why I said I don't preach a philosophy. I don't convert anybody to anything, because that's not what I do. It's about finding the way for that person to return back to their fundamental consciousness, their fundamental self.
Yeah, that's just so great. And actually, you had brought up one more question before I get to the final one. But I was curious about, when somebody comes in for therapy, right? What do you think are some things that the patient or the client, whatever you want to call them, could do to help their full experience? Because I had a friend who wasn't really he didn't like therapy, and I kind of asked him a little bit. I was curious about what's kind of like, what do you do? And he's like, well, I just kind of expected them to be able to figure that out. And I was like, what in the world's going on here? But I feel like there has to be some type of willingness from the person that is going. But what are some things that people can do going into a therapy session that could help them get the best results, that they can kind of prepare for?
They can really prepare for anything, to be honest with you. It's
Mm-hmm.
because in the initial meeting, you have a couple of things going on. You have the client or the patient bringing in all their history, all of their worries and all their fears, right, into the therapy relationship. It's not just, oh, the therapist is doing something to me. That idea, by the way, is old, right? It's a relationship, right? And in that relationship, right, it takes time and trust for this person to reveal themselves and to show all these things in a safe space, so then the transformation can happen. So I would say that out of 10 people, let's just keep it a rough number, that, let's say, start with me, I would say 8.5 will stay in therapy. And the characteristics that I see in those are usually some level of maturity, that they've been through life. They might have seen a therapist here and there, and they're ready. They're just like, whatever's going on with me, I want to be done with, right? That's it. Now, I do get some people every week who are new to therapy, and in those experiences, as long as they're willing and wanting to, then no problem. Then it's a matter of us just having the chemistry.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. And I really like that idea that, that the fact that it is a relationship, right? I think a lot of people do come into this thinking that this therapist is just some other person that that'll never understand them, right? Sometimes. And I think when you get into the
Yeah.
relationship factor, I think that's where the trust starts to come in. And
Oh
you
yeah.
start to kind of foster that relationship, and it makes you want to be more open, right? And in those
Of
relationships,
course.
whereas in a professional, or in that kind of different relationship where this person's something other than that, it can kind of it can dehumanize them to the point where you don't want to be a part of it, right?
If
Yeah.
if a person's walking in and they're like, that's a therapist, and they forget that it's a human being, I mean,
Yeah.
then it's like going to the doctor to have my kidney removed or something like that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. It's definitely doesn't sound too good. But Alex, I've really enjoyed this whole
Thank
conversation.
you.
I think I've definitely learned quite a bit. I'm sure a lot of my viewers have. But what is your message to the viewers out there, whether they may have experienced trauma, or just anything like that? I mean, what would you say to somebody, one of my viewers that are dealing with mental health? I mean, what would your main message be to those people?
One line. There is nothing wrong with you. You are perfectly divine as you are.
Wow, I had to sit with that one for a second. I know it reminds me a lot of my pastor says that quite a bit. That was one of his things that he's always trying to get us to understand. And
And
it's
it's not in here.
yeah,
It's in here.
yeah,
You have
exactly.
to breathe. Yeah, you have to breathe it into the heart chakra. It has to go in here. That's where it goes.
Hmm.
Not up here. Here.
Yeah, and I mean, thank you again, Alex, for being on. I
Thank
think
you.
well, I say I think a lot, but it's a very interesting point that you kind of bring to this conversation, because I'm always kind of one of these intellectual people, and I use that in more of a pejorative manner in this sense, just because I'm always thinking about things, and I'm always talking about critical thinking. But a couple of podcasts ago, I kind of thought, I think there's a kind of a limit to this, because all of a sudden you can critically overanalyze to the point where you're just stuck in a loop. And I think
Yeah.
that's where you kind of come in, and you kind of bring us out of this cage or this hamster wheel, right, and kind of let us go out into nature and
And
go in.
then,
Yeah,
but thinking, we don't stop thinking, right?
exactly.
We change who we perceive as the thinker.
Exactly. Wow, that's tremendous stuff. And yeah, Alex, once again, thank you for being on the mental health chats. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I
Yeah.
really appreciated that.
Hey guys, thanks for watching Mental Health Casual. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more videos.
I'll send her